Following an overnight stay at the Sofitel Heathrow, we flew American Airlines to Miami, where we stayed for 3 nights at the Marriott Biscayne Bay. Our room gave us a view of the cruise port, and if we woke early enough in the morning, we could see the ships manoeuvring into position. Our first full day in Miami, we took a cruise on the Intracoastal Waterway with our friends Maria and Paul. This takes you through the Port Everglades cruise port in Fort Lauderdale, and also close to some very expensive private mansions. Also get close to some of the world's most expensive super yachts. Next day we visit Little Havana, where many Cuban exiles live, and have dinner in the world's most famous Cuban restaurant. A monument to the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's the morning our cruise begins, and Marina is waiting for us in Miami Cruise Port. Our next stop is Port Canaveral, where we have a pre-booked shared taxi to the Kennedy Space Center. Atlantis was the 4th space shuttle to enter service and flew 33 missions until it was the second to last one in service when it retired in 2011. Each of the shuttle's 3 main engines produced more than £500,000 of thrust. Florida weather. Charleston, South Carolina. After a couple of hours spent at a shopping mall near the airport, we came back into town and walked around the area not far from the cruise terminal. Traditionally, Charleston townhouses are turned round so that their narrow end faces the street. This was apparently for taxation purposes. Back to the ship, past the custom house. There's a day at sea before we arrive in New York. We berth at the Manhattan Cruise Terminal, Pier 90. We get a taxi to One World Tower, also known as the Freedom Tower, on the site of the Twin Towers. Two reflecting pools with waterfalls occupy the footprints of the original two towers. The names of all the victims are inscribed around the edges. Next to it is the Oculus, a futuristic transportation hub. On this clear sunny day, the lighting effect inside is spectacular. The One World Observatory is on the 102nd floor of the Freedom Tower, and it gives spectacular views of Manhattan and the surrounding areas of New Jersey and New York. We round our visit off with lunch at the One Dine restaurant. There's another sea day before we reach Boston, and on the way we pass through a little choppy weather. Early morning mist as we approach Boston Harbour. We had pre-booked the Boston trolley, and this proved to be a good thing. The trolley picked us up at the dockside and took us into Boston and around some of the historical sites. The tomb of Benjamin Franklin in a city centre graveyard. Boston Common. The bar that was used as the exterior shot of Cheers. Fenway Park, home of the Boston Red Sox. The Old South Meeting House. Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market. The Old State House. And Paul Revere's house. Portland, Maine next, and our luck with the weather has run out. As we'd never been here before, we decided just to go for a stroll and see what turned up. We were approached by a local journalist who was intending to write a piece about the experience of cruise ship visitors to Portland and she asked if she could show us round, so we gladly accepted. The old wharves are in the process of slowly being smartened up, a familiar story from other ports we know. Next stop, Bar Harbour, and we've got our weather back. The Bar Harbour Inn on the waterfront is now significantly larger than it was the first time we came here 17 years ago. This is a tender port, and we come ashore at a new landing stage. Even in this wealthy town, there's property ripe for a makeover. Time for a lobster roll at the West Street Cafe, completely rebuilt and just as good as ever. Now Marina leaves the United States and enters Canada and the port of St. John, New Brunswick, where the tidal flow is so strong that we need a tug to get in. There's a sparkling new cruise terminal, however, and outside we meet our pre-arranged shared taxi tour. Our first stop is the Reversing Falls, where the flow of the St. John River is reversed twice a day by the sheer force of the incoming tide. We only saw it going in one direction though. Leaving the city, we head off to explore further up the Bay of Fundy. We stopped for lunch at St. Martin's, near this covered bridge. And there's another covered bridge. Back in St. John, we see the Loyalist House, and we finish our tour at the Victorian Market. Next stop is Shelburne, Nova Scotia. This is a tender port, and Marina will be the only cruise ship visiting this year. Our welcome was very warm and very historical.
You ready? You ready? 1, 2, 3. All right.
Shelburne makes a lot of its British Empire loyalist history. Many buildings have been preserved and restored from the old days. Some of the preservation and reconstruction is due to film companies and television producers who've used this as a location. This entire sawmill was rebuilt and moved for a film production.
It was for the big belt.
Yeah, my.
More modern houses seem to be designed in keeping with the tradition. Shelburne was a genuine, unexpected highlight of this cruise. Halifax, capital of Nova Scotia, greets tourists up front with its links with Samuel Cunard. This is the man himself. The waterfront area has been significantly improved since we first visited here, and improvements continue. We didn't venture into the city centre itself on this occasion, but were happy with a quiet day sticking around the ship.
And at the end, like $30 Canadian.
Following another sea day, we arrive in Saguenay, Quebec. Saguenay lies on a fjord which is linked to the St. Lawrence River. There's a very new jetty and cruise visitor centre. It's very cold, but the locals have turned out in period costume to welcome us. We've pre-booked a local minibus tour. The first stop is by a monument to the founding pioneer families of the area. The pyramid is made from traffic signs for some reason. The main part of the tour is in the national park, but the higher reaches are closed because of the snow. In this village, local families make wood carvings of nativity scenes. This has been our coldest day so far, but we'll be back in Saguenay next week. Next is Quebec City, where we will now spend an extra day because we can't make it to Montreal because of low water levels in the St. Lawrence River. First at the new cruise terminal, we have a fine view of Chateau Frontenac in the upper town. It's easy to explore the lower town on foot, starting at the Place Royale with its bust of King Louis XIV. This area is now largely given over to restaurants, cafes and smart shops. You can reach the upper town either by steps or by funicular. We emerge in front of Chateau Frontenac, a railway hotel. The toboggan, which is open throughout the winter, leads up to the Plains of Abraham, where the Battle of 1759 saw the deaths of both the British and French commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm, who are memorialised here. This statue is of Samuel de Champlain, who founded Quebec in 1608. Taking a stroll through the streets of the old town, this is the town hall. The Price Building is the tallest building in the old city. We had booked a local tour to visit Montmorency Falls just outside the city. Trois-Rivières is halfway between Quebec and Montreal, and Marina will now spend 2 days here doing its turnaround. The first day we were given a free trip to Montreal to see what we were missing. Our bus leaves us near Place Jacques Cartier, presided over by Nelson on his column, actually 30 years older than the one in London, balanced by a nearby statue of an earlier French hero. The old market hall dates from the 1840s. The chapel of Notre Dame de Bon Secours dates from 1771. The Basilica of Notre Dame dates from the 1820s, but the ornate interior wasn't completed till near the end of the 19th century. Across the Place d'Armes from Notre Dame is the old Bank of Montreal. And so back to pick up our bus to Trois-Rivières. Next morning we do our exploring of Trois-Rivières. The main street is the Boulevard des Forges. Unfortunately, our sightseeing was brought to a premature end by a trip on the steps of the cathedral, necessitating a hospital visit. And so next morning we're back in Quebec, sailing in past the Heights of Abraham and berthing again in front of the Chateau Frontenac. It's déjà vu all over again for our return visit to Saguenay. It's even colder this time, and the welcome is a little more muted. We stayed in the town this time. Visited the local church. Next stop, Newfoundland and Corner Brook. A very small town in a picturesque part of the world. We had coffee and a bun at the Brood Awakening coffee shop. Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon is a little bit of France off the coast of Newfoundland. Marina is berthed a mile or so outside the little town, and the transport was very thin on the ground. Not much was open, except for two rather good wine shops. A rather nondescript church. Sailor's Island, just off the coast, is no longer inhabited, but apparently can be visited by ferry. St. John's is the capital of the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Marina has to enter the harbour through a very narrow inlet. St. John's was one of the earliest European settlements in North America. We have a pre-booked minibus tour, and our first stop is Cape Spear. We're looking towards Signal Hill, just the other side of St. John's, where we'll be going later. Cape Spear is the easternmost point in North America. There are two lighthouses, the original dating from 1836. This is the newer one from 1955, and this is the old one. Our next stop is the village of Petty Harbour. This is also a very old settlement and is still a working fishing harbour. Now we're on Signal Hill, looking back towards Cape Spear. We get a good view of the narrow inlet into the harbour that Marina came through this morning. Signal Hill is where, in December 1901, Guglielmo Marconi received the first ever transatlantic radio signal. Our final stop is Quidi-Vidi Village. This area is apparently becoming more and more desirable to live. We had time for a quick look round the centre of St. John's before reboarding Marina. Late afternoon, and we sail out through the Narrows, embarking on our 3-day crossing of the Atlantic. The weather for the crossing wasn't brilliant, so we were glad when the coastline of Ireland came into view and we entered Cove Harbour. Cove was, of course, the last port that the Titanic called at on its ill-fated voyage, and they do make the most of that connection here. We have a pre-booked minivan tour with Paddy Wagon, and our first call is Blarney Castle. What we can see of the castle is mostly 15th century. It's famous, of course, for the Blarney Stone, right up at the top of this tower, and that's where you lean out to kiss it if you're mad enough. Blarney House is where the family currently live. Kinsale, where the narrow harbour entrance is guarded by two 17th century forts, James Fort and Charles Fort. The tide was well and truly out. Back to Cove and St Colman's Cathedral, designed by one of the Pugin family in the late 19th century. In Dublin, the shuttle bus brings us from the docks into the Georgian centre of the city. We're going to Trinity College to see the Book of Kells. They have some enormously long trams here. This is the building that was home to the Irish Parliament for most of the 18th century, and it's directly opposite Trinity College. We can't film the Book of Kells itself, but the old library is quite a spectacular room. By now it's raining as we make our way back through Dublin, past St Stephen's Green. Holyhead, Wales. We've pre-booked a tour with Busybus. First stop is Carnarvon, outside the castle, although we don't get time to go in.
So I said to him, I said, right, I said, all right, I said, we'll get the food
A brief stop in Snowdonia National Park. Then Betws Coed, a big tourist hub in the Conwy Valley. And then Conwy, where there is also no time to visit the castle. Finally, Llanfairpwllgyngyll, a village which is famous only for having the longest name in the United Kingdom, which was artificially lengthened in the 19th century as a publicity stunt. Our last stop before the cruise ends in Southampton is Portland in the county of Dorset. The port lays on a free shuttle to the nearby seaside resort of Weymouth. There are cafes, restaurants and pubs around the old harbour. Weymouth boasts a large sandy beach. It turns out that the Port of Portland lays on a rather special departure for cruise ships. Even the police force get involved.